I never wanted to be a priest. My brother, a year older than I, always wanted to be a priest. In fact, when we were little, growing up in Queens, he would, with vanilla wafers and grape juice, play and sing Mass in the living room, and I always was forced to serve. Because if I didn't serve his Mass, he wouldn't go out in the backyard and play basketball with me ladies. No, and he went to the seminary. And then I went just to visit him. And a strange thing happened. Somehow it grew off him, and it grew on me. But we had a cousin Benny, who always wanted to be a priest, like my brother, always. And he had done theological studies, philosophy studies, and then he did theology studies in the Diocese of Brooklyn. And then when it was time to get ordained to deacon, the diocese told him to wait. They had some reservations. So he left the seminary and waited, went out to Long Island, and he got a job teaching kids. And after a couple of years, they told him no, that they didn't think they would ordain him. So then he came out to South Dakota because he heard that there were priests needed out here, and he worked with alcoholic families on a Native American reservation while he was in dialogue with the diocese out here, and after a while they told him no. So then someone suggested to him they really need missionaries in Latin America. So he went to Peru. And he worked with orphan children in Peru while in dialogue with the Archdiocese of Lima. And then he got hepatitis. So they told him no. So he came back to the States and he landed in Delaware. And he was in dialogue with the bishop there while he was working in a prison. But his health began to decline more, and he got hit by a car crossing the street one day that impaired one of his legs, so they told him no, his health wasn't good. So he went to New Orleans, and he talked to the archdiocese there, and they said, well, let's wait and see. So he began to work in a soup kitchen, feeding the hungry, but his health just continued to decline. And so they said, no, you don't have the sufficient health. My cousin Benny then ended up back in Brooklyn in a nursing facility. And I went to visit him about a week before he died. He was having difficulty breathing. His skin was all yellow from the liver disorder. He was just about blind, and he weighed 76 pounds. And he says to me, now, isn't this funny? I always wanted to be a priest, and it never happened. You never wanted to be a priest, and look at you. And then he shrugged and he says, you know what Mother Teresa says? God doesn't ask us to be successful. God asks us just to be faithful. When I celebrated his funeral mass in a church in Long Island, a big church, about a week and a half later, the church was filled to overflowing, out the doors, with people whose lives were touched, were made better, who knew love through my cousin Benny. He walked in faith. And he realized that his life was not about him. Even though he wanted to be a priest, he realized his life was not about him. And he spent his life waiting to be a priest. But while he waited, he taught kids, he worked spending these days on the theme of walking in faith, and Sunday night considering faith, and last night hope, and tonight love. When we walk in faith, when we sense that the daily events of our lives shimmer with grace, then it moves us not to think of ourselves, but it moves us to live our lives for others. And we understand that our life is not about us. I grew up in Queens, as I said, on a home with 40 houses, on a street with 40 houses, and a short street. They were all like semi-attached, you know, 2 stories, semi-attached. And as I think back, who was the person among those 40 who had the greatest influence or made the greatest impact on the street? In one corner house was Fred Babasivak, and he ran the post office of our town. So if you had a problem with your mail, he was pretty influential. But he was not the most important. At the other end of the street, second house in, was Mickey Ennis, and he was a fireman. And so that was good, because if one of your houses went on fire, he knew where it was. It was on his street, you see. But he was not the most important. Across the driveway from us was Al Hall, and he was a lawyer. And he was the richest person on the street, we all figured. But he was not the most influential. Now, the person who had the greatest influence on that street when I was growing up was a woman 5 houses down from us, whose name was Rose Bouse. When my brother and I would be playing basketball in the backyard, the concrete was uneven. And every now and then, the ball would hit a jagged piece of concrete and bounce over the fence into the neighbor's yard, whose house was attached to ours, Claire and Heinz Dahlheim. And they had lived in Berlin during the war, and they had experienced the bombing of their city, and it had left Claire a bit unstable. Now, as kids, we didn't understand this. We thought she was possessed by devils. But that's in fact what it was. She was mentally unstable. And the basketball bouncing in our yard apparently used to annoy her or set her off, so that she'd be watching from her back window. And when the ball hit a piece of concrete that was jagged and bounced over the fence into her yard, it only took one bounce in her yard, because she would fly out the back door of her house, screaming like a banshee, and she'd scoop up that basketball and run back into her house and slam the door. And that was the end of my brother and I's basketball game. And I thought, oh God, now we're going to go have another mass inside with my brothers. We didn't know what to do. But when this happened, we soon learned we could walk 5 houses down to Rose. We would sit in her house and we would tell her our problem, that Mrs. Dahlheim took our basketball. And she would then say, okay, boys, you go in the next room and sit down. And we'd go in the next room and we'd hear her pick up the phone, and she would call Claire. And we could hear Claire screaming from the next room. We'd hear her screaming through the phone. But Rose would just gently talk her down, gently make her calm, and then all of a sudden Rose would hang up the phone, she'd call us back in, and she'd say, okay, the ball will be on the front stoop of the house. So go out now, and you can get it, but over people. She would make peace between two neighbors who were warring for some insignificant thing. And when my best friend, Jimmy Hess, when his mother committed suicide, and he and his sister and their father were just unconsolable, it was Rose who was able, by sending over gifts to them or calling them on the phone, was able to begin to heal them and to bring them back into the life of the community. She was, without a doubt, the most influential person on the street. But the remarkable thing was that for all the years I knew her, she never left her bed. She was paralyzed from the waist down because of polio. Never left her bed. I never saw her leave her house. But she had the greatest influence. And so I went to her when I was confused about, after visiting the seminary, that seemed to be growing on me and growing off my brother. I went to her as a high school senior and to talk to her. I said, well, I'm not sure what to do with my life. I'm not sure what will make me happy. And I'll never forget what she told me. She says, Jimmy, most people make the mistake of thinking that happiness is something you go after. She says they don't realize that happiness is simply the consequence of living your life for others. Our lives are not about ourselves. Our lives are about others. My cousin Benny, while he waited for something that never came, lived his life for others. Rose Mouse, paralyzed in bed, when she could have easily curved in on herself with self-pity, lived her life for others. That was a source of joy then and of deep happiness. That's why in the gospel we heard this evening, Jesus says that everyone who believes in me will do wonderful things. And he sends them out and says, go. Go and preach the good news to everyone in the world. When we live by faith and we sense that daily events shimmer with the care and the grace and the boundless love of God, when we sense that, it's not then just for our own personal enjoyment or satisfaction or peace. It's for the world. It's to be proclaimed to the world, shared with the world, because it's good news. The risen one is in all things. The risen one is here. The risen one is unfolding a plan for our lives and for the world, and it is for good. How do we do that? How do we make of our lives a gift for others? How do we grasp that our lives are not about ourselves, but that there are others waiting for us? The church has those traditional, corporal and spiritual works of mercy. The corporal ones, I'm sure, are so familiar to us. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, visit the imprisoned, care for the sick, bury the dead. Those corporal works of mercy are the concrete actions of disciples of Jesus Christ, through which the world knows that we are walking in faith, that we believe. But the spiritual works works of mercy also, which too often perhaps we don't think of. They are perhaps less familiar to us. Counsel the doubtful. Instruct the ignorant. Teach. Admonish sinners. Bear patiently the troublesome. Now there's one. Bear patiently the troublesome. Comfort the afflicted. Forgive offenses. And pray for the living and the dead. Those two spiritual works of mercy are concrete practices by which we walk in faith, through which we love. If we gave ourselves over these Lenten weeks that are fast upon us to corporal and spiritual works of mercy, we would be transforming our corner of the world. We will make a radical difference by loving in this way. And this indeed is as our goal, to practice these works of mercy and to change our corner of the world. During the Balkan War, the city of Sarajevo was under siege. Vedran Smilovic was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Opera House. And one afternoon, May 27th, 1992, he stood at the window of his apartment, second or third floor window. Looking out the window, he was practicing the cello. The opera house had been destroyed by the shelling. The city was ringed around with snipers and enemy fire. And they had destroyed the opera house, so the musicians were all practicing where they lived. So he stood there at the second or third floor window of his apartment, and he was practicing the cello, and he looked out over the square that his apartment fronted. And there was a long line of starving people waiting in front of the only bakery in the city of Sarajevo, which still was making bread. And then at 4 p.m., as he was playing, a mortar shell from the hills fell from the sky and landed in the square. And 22 of his townspeople, some of them neighbors, were killed 100 yards away from him. The next day, there was another long line of people outside that bakery again. They were convinced that they could die, but they were certain that they or their families who were starving would die if they didn't get some bread to bring home to them. And at 4 o'clock, it happened. Vedran Smilovic descended the stairs of his apartment building, came out of his apartment, dressed in his tuxedo, his black tie, his uniform for playing in the Sarajevo Opera. And he had in one hand a chair, and in the other hand his cello. And he walked to the center of the square